My name is Roger Horowitz, not Eric Rao. Eric usually starts these events, but you can tell that I'm not Eric because I'm shorter and I have a beard. Eric is up in Boston and doing some meetings, but he's watching us on streaming. So hi, Eric. We'll try to carry on without you. But I want to welcome you all here to the Hagley Library for another one of our Author Talk events. Hagley, as many of you may know, is the largest business history research library in the United States. We have collections in the neighborhood of 8 miles of manuscript materials, a couple million pictorial materials, including films and pictures and glass plate negatives and things like that, and several 100,000 printed sources there. And we have scholars come from all over the world to come to Hagley to do research in our collections. Now, we like to make these collections known and available to the public, and so we organize these author talks several times a year to offer to you scholars who have made use of our collections and prepared books that are of particular interest, we think, to a broader public there. This is part of Hagley's overall mission to chart the unfolding history of American enterprise. Some of you may know we're a little hindered at the moment on the museum side because Hurricane Ida came through and did all sorts of damage to our property, including knocking out the power in the museum. But we are carrying on, as you may have seen coming in there. There are about 1 million signs on the property telling you that the museum is open and you can access the museum by going and registering at the library to go and tour the property up here. So we are persevering. We do want the local area people to know about the collections, to appreciate what we have, and that's really the focus of the author talks. We also want to let people who know about the folks who've come through here as a way of supporting the scholars who have made decisions about their projects such that they want to come through here and use our collections. So we're doing two things at the same time. Now, I'm really happy with our speaker here tonight. He's a friend to Hagley. He's been here quite a bit. I've known Eric Hintz for quite some time there. And so we're really happy that he has published his book, thereby qualifying once again to come back to Hagley for one of his presentations. Eric Hintz has been here before. He was here once upon a time when he was a wee little graduate student. No, he was never a wee little, but he was a graduate student here, and he was here on a dissertation fellowship. He's given papers here at a number of our conferences, so he's been around us for quite some time, and now he's published a book. Now, Eric currently is a historian with the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History. That's a long title, but that's where he is, and Eric's been there for about 12 years? 2010, like 11 years. Who's counting there? He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Notre Dame. Obviously, he felt that the pay opportunities in that field were not that great, so he went off to teach high school, and then he decided to really go for the high pay and become a PhD academic, and I applaud you on your strategic career decisions. We need more of you to do that in our area there. At the Smithsonian, the Lemelson Center, he oversees the fellowship program there, which I've actually been a beneficiary of, although before he was there, so this is not backslapping here. And the Smithsonian, as you might imagine, has absolutely astonishing research collections, and there's actually quite a bit of traffic of scholars between using the collections at the Lemelson Center and using the collections at Hagley. There's somewhat of a similar intellectual range there, and so we do have a lot of these people going back and forth. There's a lot of people who've gotten research grants from here, who got research grants at the Smithsonian, and there's also people who work there, who used so on and so forth. So we're friends institutionally as well, and the Lemelson Center is just a terrific institution on its own merit there. He also, of course, Lemelson Center is part of the Museum of American History. It's an interesting relationship, but I won't go into that. But Eric is also working on a number of exhibitions that are in development there. The most fun one, I think, right now is about sports technology. And Eric tells me that he's working on instant replay technology and its development. Unfortunately, he's not going to talk about it here because I want to hear all about it, but I think that's going to be a great topic here. His research interests are in history of science and technology, U.S. business, economic history, especially invention and R&D. And of course, what we're focusing on here is that he's published his book, American Independent Inventors, An Era of Corporate R&D, from MIT, just came out in 2021. And despite supply chain problems, we have copies for sale in the back for literally half the price. Carol Lockman practically flew to wherever they're being printed to bring them back here. It was not that simple, but Carol, being Carol, she got them here, and she took care of that. I should say, too, that for these events, we depend upon the support of Hagley in many, many ways. Of course, one very important area of support is the Board of Trustees supports the library, the expense that involves in staffing and whatever. They support the programming of the center, the staff of the center, and of course the staff makes this possible. Greg Hargraves in the back, who is the person who has been overseeing the Zooming, the streaming. Ben Sman, who is up in the balcony in the lights, who is our oral historian, and with me helps a lot with these events, especially when it comes to Zoom presentations there. Carol, who arranges logistics for the event there, and the return of snacks in the back, where we've been given dispensation by the gods here that you can have coffee and sweets, and you don't have to worry about the virus for that there. So that's my little intro. I want to bring Eric up here to talk about his book. So Eric, why don't you come up? And I'm now going to raise the height of the podium. Look at that.
That's cool.
How's that?
That's super cool.
Give it a try.
Thank you.
I mean, Hagley is the center of technology, so we got to be able to.
That's awesome.
How about we a little higher? How's that?
That's very good.
Okay.
I was thinking, so I was actually thinking I would have to hold the thing up so I could see it, but now I don't have to. It's all right here.
Okay.
That's yours, I think, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Roger. Hi, everybody. How's it going? Thank you and good evening to everyone here at Hagley Soda House and online. Thanks for coming out and logging on. I'm delighted, as Roger said, we've known each other for a long time. Whoops, what did I just do there? We'll figure that out. I'm just delighted to be here talking about my new book this evening. It draws in part, as Roger said, on collections from Hagley, and so my plan is to talk a little bit about that tonight. Do you want to take a minute and see if we can figure that out? I don't know if I touched something wrong or something. Oh, you know what? It's probably that. There's all kinds of stuff going on. It's
There it is. It's fine. It's just the plug.
This was just this one? Okay. Okay. Sorry, Greg. Okay. Restart. Delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Okay. So my plan is to spend a few minutes describing the genesis of the book and thanking several colleagues, and then I'll highlight several themes and findings from the book before taking your questions and engaging in a discussion. All right, so Roger mentioned the tenderfoot graduate student, and there he is. So I was looking through some old family photos, and I found this old grainy picture of me, my wife Emma, and my older son Patrick, and we were sitting by the banks of the Brandywine River in the mill race, and this was in 2008 when I was in residence as a dissertation fellow here at Hagley. So this little tyke in the picture now is 14 years old. He's 5'9", and he has a killer jump shot. So that sort of gives you like a sense of how long I've been thinking about these ideas, researching, and it took a long time for these things to come together. So with, when you spend so much time as this working on a book, you accrue a lot of personal debts, a lot of intellectual debts. So bear with me here while I take a few minutes to offer some acknowledgements. The book began as a dissertation in the History and Sociology of Science department at just up the road in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania. My advisors there were Ruth Schwartz-Cowan, Susan Lindy, and Walter Licht. Bernie Carlson at the University of Virginia was an outside reader. While working on the dissertation, I was fortunate to receive generous financial and intellectual support from the Science History Institute, the Smithsonian Institution, the Consortium for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine, the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History, the Business History Conference's John E. Ravinsky Fellowship in Business and Economic History, and of course, the Hagley Museum and Library. And as the smiles in this picture suggest, I have very fond memories of living for 4 months down in the blacksmith's house on the Hagley campus, walking along the Brandywine River every morning, doing research right here in the Soda House, and working with great folks like Phil Scranton, Roger Horowitz, Carol Lockman, the late Lynn Catnese, and just the entire Hagley team. So I'm really delighted by the invitation to speak here this evening, and I just want to thank everyone at Hagley for helping me discover and develop many of the stories that you'll hear in my talk this evening. The dissertation became a book thanks to my colleagues at the Smithsonian's Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation where I work. I joined the Smithsonian after finishing my PhD in 2010, and my colleagues Arthur Malella, Joyce Beatty, and Arthur Demarich invited me to revise and expand the dissertation into a book for the Lemelson Center's book series with MIT Press, working with the editor there, Katie Helke. Finally, I'll just say the book is dedicated with love to my wife Emma, my son Patrick, and Gavin, and they have just encouraged me and sustained me at every point along the journey. So before I get into the talk proper, I just kind of wanted to ask, do we have any inventors or patentees or research scientists in the audience? Okay, awesome. I figured we might, so I took a chance sort of asking this question because we're just down the road from the famous DuPont experimental station. And so I'm glad that you're here. And I'll just sort of say that I approach this subject from a certain point of view, which I think will be pretty clear when we get into the talk, but also with a healthy dose of humility about the many things I don't know or may have misinterpreted. So I'm counting on you guys to keep me honest. I hope if I've got something wrong during the talk, you'll ask me some challenging questions, and I know we'll have a great discussion here at the end of our time. Okay, terrific. So with that, let's turn the clock back to 1927 with the episode that opens the book. On December 11th, 1927, Maurice Holland of the National Research Council delivered a luncheon speech titled "The Vanishing American Genius." Holland suggested that, quote, "The independent inventor of today has little chance against the formidable research organizations of modern industry, and that the days of the solitary genius in the garret had passed. The work of invention," Holland argued, was now directed by teams of salaried scientists and engineers working in 1,000 industrial laboratories across the United States. Holland's speech garnered an impassioned response. For example, Assistant Patent Commissioner William A. Kennan protested that, quote, "The day of the independent inventor has not passed. Nothing could be further from the truth. This fallacy," said Kennan, "had emerged thanks to boosters like Holland, who tended to exaggerate the increasingly important role that corporate laboratories were playing in the introduction of new technologies." This exchange, I think, captures many of the historical themes and tensions that animate my research. In August, as Roger mentioned, I published American Independent Inventors in an Era of Corporate R&D with MIT Press. The book considers the changing fortunes of American independent inventors since the emergence of science-based industrial research. The book challenges several long-held assumptions about the sources of invention during an important transitional period in the first half of the 20th century. The earlier 19th century had witnessed the so-called heroic era of invention when mythic individuals like Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell created entirely new industries from their inventions while achieving widespread fame. However, beginning around 1900, several large firms, including General Electric, DuPont, and AT&T, established the first research and development laboratories in which teams of PhD scientists collectively developed new products and processes with all resulting patents assigned to the company. Eventually, many contemporary observers, and later, many historians, joined Maurice Holland in the belief that corporate R&D labs had displaced independent inventors as the wellspring of innovation. For example, in his book, American Genesis, historian Tom Hughes has suggested that after World War I, the independent inventors, quote, "never again regained their status as the preeminent source of invention and development. Industrial scientists, well publicized by the corporations that hired them, steadily displaced in practice and in the public mind the figure of the heroic inventor as the source of change in the material world." However, the historical patent data, I think, tell a different story. This graph shows US patent activity in the 20th century. The solid line represents patents granted to individuals. The dotted line represents patents granted to corporations. Let's see if I can work the cursor here. All right. All right. We can see that patents granted to individuals here actually outnumbered corporate patents until about 1933, and then they kind of closely mirror corporate output until about 1950. Now, corporations eventually dominate patenting after 1950, but individual inventors continue to produce a stable output of 10,000 to 15,000 patents every year. So I would argue that the first half of the 20th century was a long transitional period when independents such as Chester Carlson, Garrett Morgan, Samuel Rubin, and Earl Tupper made notable contributions to the overall context of innovation. Thus, contrary to most interpretations of this period, I argue that individual, independent inventors were not supplanted by corporate R&D labs, but instead persisted alongside them as an important, though less visible, source of inventions. Focusing on the years from 1890 to 1950, the book documents how American independent inventors competed and sometimes partnered with their corporate rivals, adopted a variety of flexible commercialization strategies, established a series of short-lived professional groups, lobbied for fair patent laws, and mobilized for 2 world wars. An epilogue traces how the post-war experiences of independent inventors often mirrored, but sometimes diverged from the patterns of their predecessors. Overall, the book reframes the period from 1890 to 2015 as an era when both independent inventors and corporate R&D labs contributed substantially to technological innovation. It asks and answers this big question: what was it like to be an independent inventor during an era of corporate R&D, to be a David in an era of Goliaths? To address that big question, the book draws upon a wide range of sources to highlight common attitudes and experiences among multiple independent inventors. Unlike a biography of a single inventor, which could be discounted as an exceptional case, the book does not provide an in-depth portrait of any one individual. Rather, it weaves together short vignettes and relevant episodes from the archival papers, diaries, and memoirs of dozens of inventors to discern their common attitudes and experiences. Corporate records from big firms like DuPont to small firms like the Schaefer Pen Company describe how independent inventors partnered with a broad spectrum of companies and often figured prominently in their strategies for innovation. The institutional records of organizations such as the Franklin Institute and the Inventors Guild illuminate how independents developed professional networks and lobbied collectively for political reforms. The records of scientific associations and pro-research lobbying groups, such as the National Research Council and the National Association of Manufacturers, reveal the ideological tensions between independent inventors and the industrial scientists who sought to displace them. Government sources, including patent statistics, agency records, and congressional testimony, document the relative scale of independents' participation in the economy while shedding light on their political activities and wartime service. Finally, published primary sources, including daily newspapers and trade journals, such as Scientific American, provide contemporary accounts of important events and suggest how the media and the public perceived independent inventors. The book is organized thematically. Each of the interior chapters considers an important aspect of inventors' experiences during the period from 1890 to 1950. Chapter 7 is an epilogue that brings the story forward chronologically up to the near present, while a final concluding chapter suggests why we should continue to care about independent inventors. Over the next few minutes, I'll step through the book's chapters to present a few highlights, but first, let me quickly define and characterize these 2 competing modes of innovation. An individual, lone, or independent inventor was defined by his or her relative solitude and autonomy. Independents did not perform their work as salaried employees. Rather, they worked for themselves and made their own decisions about which problems to pursue. Most individual inventors usually worked alone, although some retained 1 or 2 assistants, often members of their family. Independents were responsible for setting up and equipping a suitable place to work, which often meant their kitchens, basements, or garages. Some independents invented full-time, and some moonlighted as part-time inventors while working conventional jobs to support themselves and their families. Independents retained control over their intellectual property, and they incurred all the upfront financial risks involved in trying to bring an invention to market. The life of an independent inventor was often financially precarious, since he or she might spend years developing an idea before realizing any profits, if ever. In contrast, an industrial researcher, corporate scientist, or employee inventor performed his or her duties as a full-time, salaried employee. While the educational attainments of independence varied widely, an industrial researcher usually held an advanced degree in physics, chemistry, or engineering as a prerequisite for employment. Once hired, industrial researchers joined a team of fellow scientists and technicians who worked collaboratively in a fully equipped R&D laboratory. Industrial researchers tackled specific problems assigned by their research director. Sometimes these were pure, open-ended scientific investigations, but corporate scientists usually engaged in applied research to improve the firm's existing products and operations. As stipulated in their employment contracts, industrial researchers assigned any new inventions to their firms. The corporation and its stockholders, not the individual researcher, incurred the risks and costs involved in commercialization. So the firm, not the individual researcher, also kept any resulting profits. The life of an industrial researcher was usually financially stable, but there was a ceiling on his or her earning potential. Corporate scientists typically received a straight salary for their work, which was paid whether a particular line of research panned out or not. Industrial scientists might receive a bonus for earning a patent, but none of the downstream revenues of a successful commercialization. Okay, with those distinctions in mind, let me dive into the book. By the end of World War I, critics began claiming that independent inventors were on the brink of extinction. Chapter 2 examines the roots of this misperception. Independent inventors had not disappeared, but several factors conspired to render them less visible than their heroic predecessors or contemporary corporate rivals. First, the contributions of women and African American inventors were often obscured because of racial and gender discrimination. Some inventors intentionally concealed their own identities to avoid prejudice at the patent office and in the marketplace. For example, in The Woman Inventor, publisher Charlotte Smith described the struggles of Ellen Eglin, an African-American housekeeper, government clerk, and inventor from Washington, D.C. Eglin invented a mechanical clothes wringer, but sold it to a white male patent agent in 1888 for only $18. Smith inquired why Eglin sold the invention for such a small sum instead of commercializing it herself. "You know I am black," Eglin replied, "and if it was known that a Negro woman patented the invention, white ladies would not buy the wringer." Eglin chose to sell her patent and obscure her role in its invention to avoid a prejudiced marketplace. Garrett A. Morgan, an African-American inventor from Cleveland, Ohio, went to even greater lengths to conceal his racial identity. Morgan patented a gas mask in 1914, but unlike Eglin, he did not sell his invention under duress. Instead, Morgan featured white actors in his advertisements and trade literature, shown here on the left. He also hired white associates to pose as him while demonstrating the gas mask at inventors' fairs and trade shows. The Cleveland newspapers revealed Morgan's racial identity during a daring, highly publicized rescue in 1916, and this is Morgan here with his gas mask in the rescue. And this publicity led racist customers to actually cancel their orders. So in a paradox driven by prejudice, Morgan was more commercially successful when he intentionally concealed his race, but less commercially successful when publicity favorable to his invention revealed his true identity. A few independent inventors found their contributions obscured when Thomas Edison falsely claimed credit for their inventions. For example, Frank Sprague pioneered some of the first electric motors, trolleys, subway systems, and elevators. When Sprague reluctantly sold his business to Edison General Electric in 1889, it was quickly rebranded as the Edison System of Electric Railways. Sprague wrote angry letters to the editor to defend his achievements, and his widow, Harriet, even published this 1947 pamphlet called Frank J. Sprague and the Edison Myth to refute Edison's self-aggrandizing claims. However, Edison's powerful mythology helped assure Sprague's relative obscurity. Finally, individual Finally, individual firms and pro-research associations developed sophisticated PR campaigns to extol the virtues of corporate R&D while characterizing the independents as antiquated and extinct. For example, this 1924 General Motors advertisement on the left featured a solitary mechanic in his garage, yet suggested that automotive developments were, quote, no longer dependent upon the work of isolated inventors. Instead, GM maintained, quote, the largest research laboratory of its kind, a 6-acre plant in Dayton, Ohio, to ensure the continuous improvement of its vehicles. A decade later, General Motors converted its Chicago World's Fair exhibits into a traveling circus for science called the Parade of Progress. Between 1936 and 1939, 50 men drove a caravan of 33 vehicles to 146 cities and amazed 3 million visitors with displays of GM's R&D prowess. Now, overall, with their superior resources, corporate PR teams could simply generate more publicity than the independents, right? It's like no match for Frank Sprague writing a letter to the editor. And in the end, they convinced the public that independent inventors were obsolete and extinct while portraying R&D labs as the wave of the future. So those are some of the reasons I would suggest that the independents are less visible and kind of seem like they're fading away. Okay, chapter 3. Independent inventors learn to adapt and survive in this evolving competitive landscape. Chapter 3 describes how individual inventors evaluated and deployed a variety of commercialization strategies to earn a living from their inventions. Inventors could either make, sell, or LI. That is, they could found an entrepreneurial startup to manufacture and market an invention. They could sell the patent to an established firm for a one-time fee, or license the patent to a manufacturing partner to earn royalties and consulting fees. Established firms faced a parallel set of choices as they developed new technologies. Finally, both inventors and firms could pursue several of these approaches simultaneously in a mixed hybrid economic strategy. So let's take a look at some of these examples. So this is a make example, kind of the traditional develop a startup and pursue your own invention. Okay, independent, lost my place there, sorry. Joseph Friedman reluctantly became an entrepreneur after failing to find a corporate buyer for his 1937 flexible drinking straw patent. Friedman sold real estate to pay the bills. On the weekends and evenings, he developed a machine to automate the accordion-like crimping of the straws. Friedman built a successful small family business by assembling some startup capital from his in-laws and hiring his sister Betty to direct the Flex Straw Company's advertising and sales efforts. However, many independent inventors preferred to avoid the perils of entrepreneurship, specialize in the work of invention, and sell their patents to established firms for a one-time fee. For example, in 1914, Henry J. Gaisman invented the autographic Kodak, a camera attachment that allowed a photographer to expose a portion of the negative and make notations with a stylus. Gaisman sold his patent to Eastman Kodak for $300,000, which was noted in the August 8, 1914 issue of Scientific American, there on the left. Just 1 month later, in the same journal, Kodak ran its first advertisement for the autographic Kodak, but Gaisman's name was entirely absent from the copy. When inventors sold their patents to established firms, they found their contributions erased in favor of corporate brands, which again made them more invisible. Now, despite their disparaging advertising rhetoric, corporate R&D labs frequently forged cooperative alliances with independent inventors to license their patents as a complement to the inventions they developed in-house. Through these inventor-firm alliances, innovation occurred inside, outside, and across these firms' permeable organizational boundaries. For example, during World War II, inventor Samuel Rubin developed an improved button cell battery that could withstand the heat and humidity of the Pacific Theater. Rubin licensed the miniature mercury cell to the P.R. Mallory Company, which manufactured millions of batteries for use in portable walkie-talkies. After the war, Rubin worked with Mallory's R&D team to commercialize the miniature mercury cell for use in hearing aids, pacemakers, and electric watches. Later, Rubin and Mallory co-developed a new line of copper-top alkaline batteries for use in radios, flashlights, and cameras. In 1965, Mallory rebranded its booming battery business and evolved into the multi-billion-dollar company we know today as Duracell. Long before it became fashionable to speak of open innovation, Mallory celebrated this long-term partnership, and I just love this example. They dedicated their new R&D laboratory to an independent inventor, right? That's the plaque there on the right. Independent inventors led itinerant peripatetic careers as they migrated into and out of employment and forged these cooperative alliances. For example, Everett Bickley took salaried engineering positions at automaker EMF Studebaker, food company H.J. Heinz, and radio firms RCA and Philco. He also sold real estate for a while, and while employed at those jobs, Bickley moonlighted as an independent inventor and developed his most successful invention, an automated bean sorter. Inspired by his time at Heinz, Bickley's sorter used photoelectric cells to optically inspect the beans passing by on a conveyor belt, and attached vacuum tubes sucked up and discarded any rejects or debris. Around 1931, Heinz ordered its first 4 automated bean sorters. So Bickley quit his job at Philco. He revived the dormant Bickley Manufacturing Company and forged a multi-year alliance with Heinz, his former employer. So again, the point of this example is that I found that inventors like Bickley alternated repeatedly between periods of employment and independence. Individual inventors cherished their independence and autonomy, yet they willingly banded together to confront their professional challenges. Chapter 4 documents how independent inventors established a series of organizations to help them commercialize their inventions, lobby for political reforms, and garner respect from a skeptical public who assumed they were extinct. For example, Philadelphia's Franklin Institute offered a range of services to help independents develop and showcase their inventions, including a lecture series, drafting school, technical library, invention fairs and exhibitions, medals and cash prizes, and the free evaluation of new ideas. A who's who of American inventors passed through the Franklin Institute, including Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, George Westinghouse, and Elihu Thomson, shown here giving a lecture in 1913. Faced with perennial financial difficulties, the Institute gradually abandoned these technical services and refashioned itself as a popular science museum in the 1930s. As the Franklin Institute evolved from a professional society for adults into a science museum for children, American inventors lost an important source of institutional support. Inventors also banded together for patent reform. Belgian-American inventor Leo H. Baekeland is best known for inventing Bakelite, a synthetic plastic. But he was also a founding member of the Inventors Guild and a passionate advocate for patent reform. The Guild, established in 1910, sought to remedy the overcrowded conditions and excessive delays at the Patent Office. It also sought to protect independent inventors against wealthier rivals. In patent infringement disputes, wealthy corporations could compel excessive testimony, introduce delaying motions, and purposefully prolong their cases to bankrupt poor independent inventors until they capitulated. In 1912, Baekeland told Congress that the U.S. patent system was, quote, a godsend for large corporations and a very poor thing for an inventor who is not a wealthy man. Ultimately, the Guild was ineffective, and Baekeland's lobbying resulted in no new legislation. In addition, communities of socially marginalized inventors banded together to obtain mutual support and public recognition from a public that assumed they did not exist. At the turn of the 20th century, women and African Americans challenged the pernicious assumption that they were intellectually inferior and incapable of being inventors. In an era of limited suffrage and Jim Crow discrimination, women and African Americans could still take advantage of the U.S. patent system, which made no exclusions based on sex, race, age, national origin, or any other category. Thus, invention became a vehicle for enhanced social status, economic mobility, and civil rights. When women and African Americans earned patents, objective, government-issued proof of their creativity and ingenuity, then sexist and racist arguments suggesting their supposed inferiority became more difficult to sustain. In this context, Suffragist Charlotte Smith emerged as a crusader for women inventors in the 1880s and 90s. In 1888, Smith secured a small congressional appropriation and persuaded the Patent Office to publish a comprehensive list of women inventors to whom patents have been granted by the U.S. government. Using this list, Smith corresponded with women inventors across the country and published their stories in The Woman Inventor, a periodical which we saw earlier. She also attempted to establish the Woman Inventors Mutual Aid and Protective Association, a Washington, D.C. patent agency staffed entirely by women and dedicated to helping women inventors obtain patents and commercialize their inventions. Smith was ultimately unable to sustain her ambitious plans. The Woman Inventor ceased publications after just 2 issues, and the patent agency never took flight. Nevertheless, Smith succeeded in galvanizing women inventors into a recognizable professional community at a time when few people scarcely realized they existed. Similarly, Black leaders sought to publicize the accomplishments of an emerging class of Black inventors who could serve as inspirational heroes for their communities. As the federal government began underwriting major international fairs and expositions, Black elected officials demanded a list of Black patentees to aid the development of displays featuring Black inventors. In this context, a Black congressman and inventor, George Washington Murray, a Republican from South Carolina, entered the names and inventions of 92 Black patentees into the congressional record, including 8 inventions of his own, during an 1894 floor speech. Murray's roster was compiled by a Black patent examiner named Henry E. Baker. Baker assembled and published several lists highlighting the achievements of Black patentees, including Jan Matzeliger, the inventor of a shoe-lasting machine, and Elijah McCoy, the inventor of a lubrication system for locomotives, better known as the real McCoy. An expanded search in 1913 to mark the 50th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation turned up 1,200 leads, but Baker could confirm only 800 patents as definitively earned by Black inventors. In his book, The Colored Inventor, Baker explained that many Black inventors were hesitant, like Garrett Morgan, to acknowledge their heritage because of racial prejudice, resulting in the systemic underrepresentation of Black inventors in the patent records. Baker's list emerged from a growing interest among Black Americans to display the inventive genius of their community. Richmond attorney Giles B. Jackson founded the Negro Development and Exposition Company to capitalize on that interest. Jackson secured funds from Congress, the Virginia State Legislature, and individual donors to erect a Negro building for the Jamestown Tercentennial Exposition of 1907, which marked the 300th anniversary of America's first permanent English settlement. The Negro building included a 1,200 square foot invention section that displayed 50 prototypes and 351 US patent specifications contributed by African American inventors. These included G.H. Carr's ingenious chicken incubator and bread oven, shown on the right. Together, Black leaders like Murray, Baker, and Jackson collectively convened an informal community that brought recognition and mutual support for Black inventors. Finally, as the group highlighted here demonstrates, inventors' eagerness to join these organizations made them vulnerable to predatory scams. In 1914, the National Institute of Inventors emerged as a cooperative organization in which dues-paying members could receive impartial advice on their new ideas, legal aid for earning and defending patents, and financial assistance for marketing their new inventions. Unfortunately, the National Institute of Inventors was a charade. Founder Thomas Howard simply pocketed the membership dues, embezzling thousands of dollars from America's unsuspecting inventors. Now, if you take a look at this list, overall, you'll notice that most of these fragile organizations usually disbanded within only about 10 to 20 years. Overall, this left inventors ill-equipped to address their many challenges. In the end, inventors, unlike scientists and engineers, were unable to establish their occupation as a profession. Without the benefit of a durable advocacy group to lobby for their concerns, independent inventors were unable to address inequities in the patent system that favored the corporations. Chapter 5 examines how patent reform became a key, if underappreciated, element of the New Deal antitrust movement. By the 1930s, contemporary observers had become concerned that the big technology firms were using their patents in anti-competitive ways the founders had not intended. By earning their own in-house patents, forging cross-licensing agreements with other firms, and buying up useful patents from independent inventors, corporations could acquire massive patent portfolios that provided monopolistic control over the technologies in certain industries. The big corporations then used these big patent portfolios to harass independent inventors who dared to compete in their industries. For example, GE brought a series of spurious infringement lawsuits against independent light bulb and radio tube maker Charles Eisler in an unsuccessful attempt to drive him out of business. Likewise, RCA spent a decade disputing the priority of Philo Farnsworth's television patents in an effort to gain control of that emerging industry. In 1938 and 1939, Congress's temporary National Economic Committee convened 2 hearings to investigate how General Electric, RCA, and other giants had used their patents to exert monopolistic control over their industries. During the hearings, progressive New Dealers, like Patent Commissioner Conway Coe, introduced a series of reform proposals to curb corporate abuses and level the playing field. The corporate community was wary of any changes to a patent system that had worked so well to its advantage. The National Association of Manufacturers, a conservative pro-business trade association, led the counterattack against the proposed reforms. And of course, I discovered this story in the NAM papers here at Hagley. In 1940, the NAM developed a sophisticated PR campaign called the Modern Pioneers Program. It was to mark the 150th anniversary of the US patent system. The NAM would bestow awards on America's most celebrated individual inventors and research scientists, America's modern pioneers. And you can kind of see this, I love this imagery here. It's a little small, but you can kind of see like Daniel Boone shaking hands with like an industrial person here. So they really bought into the pioneer imagery. The implicit message of this campaign was that there could hardly be anything wrong with a patent system that had encouraged brilliant inventors and scientists such as Polaroid's Edwin Land and GE's William Coolidge, shown up top with their awards. On February 27, 1940, more than 1,500 people attended the culminating Modern Pioneers Banquet at New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel. The program, broadcast over NBC Radio, featured dramatizations of the honorees' invention stories. NAM representatives also made speeches describing the benefits of the patent system and dismissed any allegations that patents had contributed to any anti-competitive monopolies. The Modern Pioneers program generated over 100 hours of radio airtime and about 5,000 press clippings. The PR campaign helped torpedo the New Deal reform efforts, resulting in a patent system that, even today, remains more advantageous for corporations. Chapter 6 traces how independent inventors mobilized to serve their country during World War I and World War II. In 1915, Secretary of the Navy, Joseph S. Daniels, invited an aging Thomas Edison to appoint 24 independent inventors to the Naval Consulting Board to develop weaponry in the lead up to World War I. 2 of those appointees were inventors Hudson Maxim and Elmer Sperry, both of whose records are here at Hagley. Hudson Maxim, there on the left, had licensed his smokeless gunpowder patents to DuPont in one of those cooperative alliances I spoke about earlier. Both Maxim and the firm, DuPont, stood to profit handsomely if the United States decided to enter the European War. While the U.S. was still neutral in September 1915, Maxim took $35,000 from his patron, Pierre S. DuPont, and published a book titled Defenseless America, which of course argued for increased military preparedness. During his service with the Naval Consulting Board, Maxim developed a new combustible material he called motorite for propelling torpedoes. He believed it would improve upon the usual method of releasing compressed air. However, the armistice arrived before his idea could be adequately tested and implemented. Elmer Sperry was probably the most effective member of the Naval Consulting Board. Sperry incorporated his gyro compass into a patented targeting and gunfire control system. By 1920, 19 U.S. dreadnoughts, 11 second-line battleships, and 9 armored cruisers had installed Sperry's fire control system. Sperry also developed a long-range, high-intensity searchlight, controls for naval torpedoes, and a bomb sight for use on airplanes. In his most audacious wartime development, Sperry modified his gyro-stabilized automatic pilot system to develop what he called an aerial torpedo, essentially an early pilotless drone. Now, beyond the inventions developed by the board's appointed inventors, the Naval Consulting Board also solicited defense ideas from the public. In an early example of government crowdsourcing, the board evaluated 110,000 military ideas submitted by America's grassroots inventors. As you can imagine, many of the ideas submitted by the public were impractical, even outlandish. In fact, the Navy implemented only one of these crowdsourced ideas by the war's end, a flight trainer invented by Guy Ruggles. Meanwhile, academic and industrial scientists thrived during World War I as they developed sonar for submarine detection and a host of synthetic chemical explosives. These disparate wartime performances only fed the growing drumbeat of assertions that corporate scientists were in the process of displacing independent inventors. Fast forward 25 years later. In 1940, the U.S. Department of Commerce established the National Inventors Council to again mobilize independent inventors, this time for World War II. The council was deluged with hundreds of thousands of military ideas from America's grassroots inventors. But this time, the independents rebounded to implement more than 100 key inventions. While historians have largely focused on the academic and corporate scientists who developed the atomic bomb and radar, independent inventors also produced several key innovations during World War II. As noted earlier, Samuel Rubin developed those improved walkie-talkie batteries that perform better in the heat and humidity of the Pacific Theater. And also here at left, we have Wadsworth Mount. He developed an anti-aircraft weapon. It was kind of like a rocket-propelled grappling hook. It was attached to a long spool of wire here. And if you could hit the airplane, it would disrupt the propellers and foul up the landing gear, causing a crash. And then on the right, Miami beachcomber Charles Hedden adapted his treasure hunting equipment to develop improved mine detectors, which saved countless Allied lives. Okay. So although independent inventors had served admirably during World War II, they could not shake the carefully constructed narrative of their obsolescence. In 1951, Harvard President James B. Conant still observed that, quote, "the typical lone inventor of the 18th and 19th century has all but disappeared." Likewise, in 1954, Fortune reported that the hired inventors who work in corporation laboratories had thoroughly supplanted the lone unaided inventor who could do little but develop gadgets. Okay. Conditions shifted considerably over the next half century. By 2005, Fortune Small Business celebrated the return of the lone inventor, while The Economist reported that technology firms had, quote, left the big corporate R&D laboratories behind. How did independent inventors achieve such a dramatic turnaround? What happened to American independent inventors in corporate R&D labs after World War II? Chapter 7 explores how the post-war experiences of independent inventors resembled and sometimes diverged from those of their predecessors. Between 1950 and 1975, the independents remained temporarily overshadowed during R&D's post-war golden age. Fueled by abundant Cold War military spending, the corporate R&D labs enjoyed big budgets, huge staffs, idyllic corporate campuses, and numerous commercial successes. Individual inventors were generally assumed to be crackpots, if not extinct. Between 1975 and 2000, corporate R&D labs struggled with a volatile economy, vigorous antitrust enforcement, low research productivity, and some embarrassing commercial failures. In contrast, independent inventors benefited from federal antitrust and innovation policies that favored entrepreneurial small businesses. Independent inventors like Apple's Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak began to reassert themselves in the economy, especially in the computing and IT sectors. Between 2000 and 2015, independent inventors experienced a renaissance, while the R&D labs restructured their operations. In a revival of earlier practices, both corporate and federal R&D labs embraced open innovation. They acquired and co-developed patents from outside independent inventors to complement the inventions they developed internally. A pro-patent shift in the courts helped independents win more infringement settlements, but they were unable to prevent patent reforms, such as first-to-file patent application priority, that disproportionately favored powerful corporations. But most importantly, the independents rehabilitated their public image. Plucky, independent inventors began to appear on TV and in feature films. In the 2008 movie, Flash of Genius, Greg Kinnear starred as underdog inventor Robert Kearns, who sued the Detroit automakers for pirating his intermittent windshield wipers. In the 2015 film, Joy, Oscar winner Jennifer Lawrence starred as Joy Mangano, the QVC star who invented the self-ringing Miracle Mop. Now, in its 13th season, ABC's Emmy-winning show Shark Tank invites Americans to watch as independent inventors like Aaron Krause pitch his Scrub Daddy sponge to a panel of angel investors. One of those sharks, Lori Greiner, shown here with Krause, had herself become a self-made millionaire by selling her patented jewelry organizers on the QVC shopping channel. So in the new millennium, I would suggest hobbyists, hackers, and garage inventors, not corporate scientists, were increasingly celebrated as the most promising sources of innovation. Okay. Coming around the bend here. In conclusion, I hope I've convinced you that independent inventors have persisted alongside the corporate R&D labs as an appreciable, if underappreciated, source of inventions. By recovering the stories of a group once considered extinct, my book extends our understanding of independent inventors beyond the heroic era and into the 21st century. It reframes the period from 1890 to 2015 as an era when both independent inventors and corporate R&D labs contributed substantially to technological innovation. And I'll finish up here with a quotation. Despite the great mass organizations which compete with him, Business Week observed in 1929, the individual genius type of inventor still holds the field as the most important single source of new ideas. He has a hard fight, but holds his own pretty well against the regimented scientists of industry. What was true then is still true today. Independent inventors have endured many challenges over the years, but they have never disappeared. The individual genius in the Garrett, in the garage, in the dorm room has long been and will always remain an important source of new technologies. So again, thanks to everyone at Hagley for inviting me here this evening. I really appreciate it. It's great to be back, and I look forward to taking your questions and engaging in a fun discussion. Thank you very much. I think the mic might be in the
Greg, you got that?
back, yeah.
Why don't you just recognize people from
Sure.
here, and Greg can walk around and
You got it. Who's the first brave person?
Perhaps more foolhardy than brave. I did enjoy your presentation, but since you asked for some comments, let me offer two unsolicited comments. I saw in your one of your opening slides that you had some biographies or stories, and I noted in there that you had, I believe, not DuBridge, but Sprague as one of the inventors and his claims for radio.
DeForest, maybe?
DeForest.
DeForest,
Yeah.
yep.
Okay. I don't know if in your research you took a look at the biographical material in Empire of the Air, or DeForest's very sketchy patent record. He never really understood very much of what he was doing.
Right.
If you're going to redo this or make some additions to it, I think Armstrong or even Marconi are probably better choices in that regard. The only other unsolicited comment is that, at least in your slides, you prominently featured the Wright brothers and their attempts patent. You had a slide showing Orville's patents, and I'm not an aeronautical engineer, and I can't comment like you can on the nature of their patent work, but you do know that their prosecution of their patent work did nothing but set the American aviation industry behind. Wing warping is not used on any planes, and their usage in this may demonstrate a whole lot more about individual initiative and very little about American industry and what it takes to make it work. But anyway, thank you very much for an interesting presentation.
You bet. I appreciate those comments. You know, one of the really challenging methodological decisions I made in putting together the book was exactly that. It's like, okay, well, you know, we can do an individual biography and people will be like, great, that's a great story of this one person. I wanted to try to tell a story of a sort of a group, a cohort, like, you know, what is this group of people? And if we look at enough of them, can we discern some patterns? And so the weakness of that approach, which you've correctly pointed out, is that, okay, well, why didn't you talk about this person? Or if you talked about this person, how come you only went, you know, so deep and didn't go deeper? And, you know, I don't talk much about the Wright brothers, even though I have a background in aerospace engineering. And they did get into all kinds of fights, not just with the military, but with the Smithsonian, where I work. There was like, you know, Samuel Pierpont Langley argued, who was the head of the Smithsonian at the time, an aeronauticist, argued that he had priority over the Wright brothers. There was a whole dust up. So there's a, you know, like many researchers, there's all kinds of clippings on the floor, right? It's like, okay, you know, at a certain point, there's some tough decisions to be made about what goes into the thing and what has to be left out. But what's brilliant about that is there's a million stories to discover, right? I could probably write a whole second book about independent inventors, especially in the later period. So yeah, I appreciate you pointing out some of those inconsistencies, and there's always more work to do. So I appreciate your comments. Thank you. Other questions?
So Eric, up here. Hi.
Salem,
Yes.
how are you?
Hello. Thanks for the fantastic talk. I have two questions, one broad, one narrow. The first is, I wonder in your research and just your thinking over your project, what role, a larger role did the American state play beyond just patents per se? Because the category of the independent inventor, I think, is like it's a very interesting one in terms of like temporality and determining like when is a person independent versus when are they dependent, and what exactly are they independent on, or independent from, or dependent on. So if, you know, funding comes from an agency or department of the American state, and they're asking for a particular kind of product, does that have actually something to say about the dependency of this individual on a particular funding source or a particular set of resources? A more narrow one is actually coming from my own research into the history of industrial robots. And it kind of talks about this temporality issue. The gentleman who is commonly called the inventor of the industrial robot, George Devol, patented his device in 1954. However, pretty much every component of that patent came when he was working for a defense contractor in one of their corporate laboratories. This is during World War II and in the early Cold War. The patent was in 1954. So I think, I guess the question in the more narrow sense is, this individual makes this patent in 1954, is credited as an independent inventor. However, almost everything going into it comes out of corporate R&D laboratories while he's working for them in some sort of capacity. So did that come up with your analysis and approach to the hybrid sector, where maybe this individual is an independent inventor, but that's more of a product of our imagination and kind of our cultural PR that goes into, because he was lauded for this reason. Mm-hmm. The industrial robot is amazing because it's this independent inventor, it's not a corporate laboratory, when in fact the opposite was actually the case essentially, even though the timing of the patent was when he was on his own essentially. I'll just leave it there. Also, are you an independent academic since you're at the Smithsonian, not at a university?
Definitely have a job and earn a salary and report to the Smithsonian every day, not an independent academic. Thanks for those questions. Those are two really incisive questions and tough ones for me to answer. Let me start with the second one first. I think you're touching on the blurriness between independent corporate, especially when you have these alliances. I really love these alliances. I thought it was such an interesting thing about that I found in the research over and over and over again is that while the inventors were nominally independent, they depended on corporate patronage. They depended on military contracts. They so they were always looking for other sources of support, whether it was technical or financial. But the same was also true, right? So Mallory needed someone like Rubin to invent that battery. And DuPont needed Maxim for the smokeless powder. I mean, it's like, so there's this really interesting kind of codependent, I don't know what you want to call it, but like, neither could survive well without the other. But then you get into all these questions of, well, like, who truly owns the thing, right? And like, who should get the patent? Yeah, there probably were some disputes. I'm struggling to think of any right now, but one of the things that the corporations are really good at is writing a strong contract. And this is actually one of the reasons why these alliances with the independents are really useful for them, is because it kind of turns your inventor into, so if you think about like an R&D scientist, they're on the payroll. It's kind of like a fixed cost, right? Every year you're paying that salary. Well, if you align with one of these independent inventors and do like a contractual consulting relationship, it becomes a flexible arrangement. If they work on the thing and it doesn't pan out, written into that contract is like a kill fee, and they're like, okay, we're done, sorry it didn't work out, and they just go away and they're like no longer on your payroll. So I guess I would say I didn't really find too many of those examples where there was some contentiousness about who owned the thing or who should get the patent, because when the corporations developed these consulting contracts, they were pretty airtight about the fact that the corporation would ultimately own the thing. So I'd be interested to talk to you more about Duval, because it sounds like you kind of got away with one, which is really interesting. The first question you had was like the role of the state, and I know you love political economy, right? So, I think it's all over the place. I think, the patent statute, the IP statute is written right into the Constitution. I think it's Article 1, Section 8, right? And so at a certain level, the US government from the very beginning, like 1790, so the Constitution's 1788, by 1790 there's a patent law. And they recognize that in order to turn an idea into something economic, you have to be able to protect it, and then it becomes a tradable asset. You can sell it, license it, whatever. So there's a recognition very early from the state that it has a role in helping inventors through laws like the patent law, sort of earn a living and be able to commercialize. The courts are huge, right? So the way infringements work is the onus is on the patent owner to defend, right? So if you're Robert Kearns and you've invented the intermittent windshield wiper, and Ford is like, we're just going to infringe, come at us. Like, what do you do, right? I mean, it's really like, it's an obvious, to him at least, right? It was an obvious infringement, but it's like poker, right? Ford had more chips than he did. So it doesn't matter if you're holding the card, right, the patent, like they've got so many more chips, they're just betting against you all the time and just like wearing you down. And so I think the courts and sort of the way the patent laws are configured, where the onus is on the patent owner to defend, I think that's a huge issue for independence in terms of the way the state configures the adjudication of the patents. And then I think the military, right? So that's another one, like it's like the hugest, so the military and the needs of like World War I, World War II, the Cold War fuels so much innovation, right? Who's gonna build our bombs? Who's gonna build fuses, who's gonna build tanks, all this stuff. Independent inventors can do a certain amount of that and use that patronage, and they can do certain things, but a lot of these projects are on a scale that an independent can't handle, right? So it almost has to go, to build a bomber, you almost have to go to Lockheed or Boeing or something like that. An independent inventor can't build a bomber, but they can build a battery. So it's interesting. I think there's an interesting patronage relationship there with the state that's important, that depending on the scale of the thing could work for an independent inventor, but more often tends to work towards the R&D labs. Hope that addresses those. Thanks.
I wanted to perhaps suggest a volume 2 to your book, because you touched both in the discussion and during the presentation on one player that perhaps has not been given the attention that it merits, and that is really the federal government, the Defense Department, and so on. A dynamic that I have found really pervasive when you try as an independent inventor to take the next step, which is either through an association, as you indicated, there's 3 or 4 ways to engage, for example, private industry. Increasingly, the risk of the private industry, the corporation, has become accustomed to move their risk, which is involved in any application development of a invention, to the federal government. And what is often frustrated is that significant corporations, perhaps not the late DuPont company or General Motors, but other significant corporations have become so dependent on Uncle Sam to do the next step, which is take the invention. You are continuously referred great invention, great idea, even great invention. Go to Uncle Sam to get it financed. Well, the reality is that for an independent inventor to satisfy the accounting requirements of Uncle Sam become an extraordinary burden. In other words, I posit that a significant amount of good ideas, of useful ideas, end up not being pursued, not being commercialized, if you will, because of a reluctance, perhaps, that before was not there of corporations that now rely on federal funding to do the scale-up work, if you will. So,
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understand the question. So the question is along the lines of, do you think that the scale and difficulty of working with the federal government is an issue for the independent inventor?
that's right. In spite of the fact that, yes, independent inventors are honored in the sense that, gee, a great deal of employment, for example, comes out of the entrepreneur, and a good number of entrepreneurs attempt to bring to commercialize new stuff. The reality is that the need to satisfy the requirements of the federal government to get that to happen
Yep.
is something that perhaps is worthwhile analyzing.
Sure. No, I can't remember which really smart scholar wrote this. I want to say it was Martin Kinney maybe, or Bill Leslie, but something along the lines of the federal government is the greatest angel investor of all, right? I mean, it's like if you think about, there's a lot of really great scholarship coming out now about Silicon Valley and its history. So there's a lot, if you sort of read Wired magazine or things like this, there's a lot of buzzy talk about techno-libertarianism, and we don't need the federal government, and it's all about innovation, right? Well, I mean, who's buying the microchips in 1950 and 60? It's the federal government, because they're putting into Polaris missiles, right? I mean, it's like the chip industry is sort of built on military contracts in Silicon Valley. The largest employer forever in Silicon Valley, it may not still be, but it was Lockheed Martin by an order of magnitude, by it was a lot more. So I think we talked a little bit about scale a minute ago, and I think this is a really important thing that comes out of the research is that, and there's another distinction that we should make here too, and you kind of made it in your question, is there's invention, which is coming up with the idea, maybe sketching it, getting a patent, and then there's innovation, right? That's scale, production, manufacture, actually making a profit, commercialization. So independent inventors, because they only have so many resources usually, are really good at invention, right? They can come up with a million ideas, they could sketch it, they might even build one prototype, but like building one is one thing, but can you build 1,000, right? That's like a different problem. So the opposite is often kind of true, or could be true at corporations. They're really good at like scale, manufacturing, sales, they've got channels, they can sell things. But there can be some conservatism, right? Sometimes they have trouble breaking out of their established patterns, right? There's this great story of Kodak in the 1970s. They had an R&D scientist on their staff who invented the first digital camera in like 1975. And they're like, great, that's so awesome, what a neat thing. We're just gonna put it in a drawer over here because that will destroy our film business, right? So sometimes corporations don't want the really disruptive idea until it's too late, right? By the time they figured out, oh, digital cameras, right? Like Sony and like Canon, all the Japanese firms are kind of eating their lunch. It was almost kind of too late. So there's this really interesting tension between, scale, invention, innovation. Independent inventors are good at certain things, idea creation. Corporations are kind of good at like the scale piece. And corporations are also good at getting those federal contracts. Like I said, like if you want to build 1,000 chips, that's a job for Intel, not for an individual chip inventor. If you want to build bombers or an atomic bomb, that's a job for DuPont, Hanford, not an individual inventor. So I think you're really onto something there. So thank you for that question. I appreciate it. Other brave souls.
Hello. Let's see, I was going to say we have our own legacy inventor, Oliver Evans, in this area, where he came up with a third U.S. patent, and he incorporated a number of things he had observed in local Quaker mills and rolled them into an automated, a genius flow-through milling operation. But I was going to tell you, or give you an idea about my uncle, Reynolds Chapin, invented the radar eye. It was just like this after the war. We saw the rise in inventions. He came up with a 2-foot cube that was a radar machine for your home or for whatever, and you turn the key, and no one could approach without setting off the alarm. And it eventually ended up in the White House and Nike bases and everything else. But what he found was he couldn't protect it because everybody just, took parts of his invention. They just made the same machine. And then when he finally sold it to Pinkerton, he had to sign a non-compete clause, so he could never, work in that field again. So he went on to make like a mat that was. You step on it, and the brushes would clean your feet before you went into the building.
Cool.
Whatever.
I love it.
Like he was actually doing all these things. But there's one great idea got taken away from him. Just from you have to have a team of lawyers in order to stay independent.
That's right. So his name was Reynolds Chapin?
Yeah, Reynolds S. Chapin.
Okay, I'll have to check out Chapin. Do you happen to know if did he do this independently, or he was working with a firm when he
No,
invented?
he was totally independent. That's what was sort of interesting about him. He just, came up with he just worked through an idea and came up with it. The same thing with these other inventions he came up with, but they weren't quite as necessary. But the one made it to the White House and Nike business. That's real. That was a success.
That's extremely cool. No, I'll have to go check out Reynolds Chapin, so thank you for sharing his story.
Yeah, it almost has disappeared. There was no internet, so, just...
Well, and we, I talked early in the talk about invisibility, right? So these things that are in the White House or defending Nike installations, No one knows who that is. They don't, we don't know who these people are in the same way that we knew who Edison was, or Bell, or the Wright brothers. And I mean, that was sort of like one of the central questions that drove me. It's like, okay, like when I was a kid, I read all these books about Edison and Bell and other people, and so like you kind of knew who those heroes were, but then you just stopped knowing who they were. I was like, why is that? Like, that's like one of the central things that like made me pull my hair out. I'm like, we got to figure this out. So it sounds like this precise thing happened with him, is like there were like very important, useful things that he invented, but no one knows his name today for the most part. Well, hopefully we can shine a little light on others of his ilk through the book. So that's good. Thank you.
Could you comment on the patent law as you see it today in 2021, whether it's good for the independent inventor, or whether it's good indeed for the United States? Let me give you a few examples. In terms of having functioning patent systems where there are remedies available, the United States and Europe are perhaps the only areas, or the only markets where a patentee can have a remedy and protect its intellectual property. There are 6 billion or 7 billion people who do not live in the United States and Europe. Also, the cost of procuring and enforcing patents today is just astronomical. So one could argue that the countries that try to administer and have people play by the rules of intellectual property are hurting their businesses rather than helping their businesses, because in China and India and other places, they don't pay as much attention to intellectual property, and they don't have those costs. It's a sort of a Wild West.
Yeah.
I guess my view is that the cost of patents, complying with the patent system, is just so enormous today that it may not operate as a source of competitive advantage for the United States, for example.
It's a really great question, and I'm a historian, so I get a little squishy about the current day policy questions. It was really interesting when I was developing the book. I kind of brought MIT Press a book. I'm like, here's this great book from 1890 to 1950. Don't you want to publish it? And they said, yeah, great, but like, what happened after 1950? And so then that began like a 2-year journey of me trying to figure that out, right? Like, what happened to the independence, and like, how did things change? And the book is so much better for it. But as a historian, I do get a little nervous about commenting on anything that's less than 10, 15, 20 years old or anything like that, but I'll give it a shot. Is the current patent system good for independent inventors? And the United States. I'm not sure I'm equipped to make the comparative answer in terms of international, U.S. system, Europe, other places. I'll just focus on the U.S. So it's good in the sense that it exists. Without a patent, it's really hard to commercialize anything, because a corporation is probably unwilling to invest in your idea or put any capital toward it unless they feel like there's some protection. Another thing that's good for the independents is in the 1980s, there was a reform. It was the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. So it used to be that when you'd have a patent infringement case, it would start in the district courts, and then if it got appealed to the sort of one of the 11 circuits, and it would go to the Supreme Court. Well, you would get these weird things where a patent was valid in one circuit and not valid in another circuit, and so they decided in 1982 to make one court that would, with nationwide jurisdiction over all patent cases. And so after the 1980s, you got a lot of judges appointed during the Reagan era and later that were real intellectual property experts, and they were technically trained, so good judges for these for this special court. But you started to see you started to see judges upholding patents in cases in favor of independence. So it used to be that, like, you know, an independent prior to 1982 would like have their patent and they'd say, you know, oh, you know, big corporation, you infringed me, and they would take them to court, and then the corporation would win and the patent would be invalidated and the independent would lose. After 1982, it sort of flips, right? So you start to get cases like Robert Kearns, who actually wins against Ford. You have, I'm trying to think of some other cases. So like my patron, Jerome Lemelson, this is how he made his millions, right? So he was an independent inventor, had tons of patents, and after 1982, his fortunes changed. He started winning more of these settlements in court because the judiciary actually changed and became more pro-patent, and that worked to the advantage of independent inventors. So on one hand, the patent laws are, and the patent system is more favorable for independent inventors recently. On the other hand, the corporations really didn't like that Robert Kearns and Jerome Lemelson were getting over on them. So since 1999, 2002, in the last 20 years, there's been more patent reform in the other direction, where the corporations are trying to make it easier for the corporations to get patents. So this is the first to file priority versus first to invent. And then, of course, as always has been the case, corporations have more lawyers. They can sort of, you know, they can still make it life difficult for independent inventors. There's this new thing called the Patent Trial and Appeals Board, where you can sort of challenge a patent without going to district court. It's kind of like a administrative court within the patent office, and the independent inventors hate this. Like, if you follow any of them on Twitter, they're like, get rid of the PTAB, it's killing us. Like, so if you talk to any independent inventor, they're probably not happy with the patent system overall. But I don't know, I suppose it's probably one of those things that we'll just have to see how it plays out. And again, I'm sorry, I can't really speak to the international issues, but it's hard to imagine how an independent inventor could survive without a patent system, even with all its flaws, right? At least they've got something they can hang their hat on, they can go to court, they can defend the idea. Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Eric. Great talk. Thank you for, gotta go lower here. I'll stand on my toes. Thank you, Eric, for this talk here. It's wonderful. I'll just mention we have copies of his book in the back. It's available for $30, which is half price, and you will never see the book for less than this. This is a one-time only offer. You got to do it right here, so pick up a copy. He'll sign it for you, even better there. And thanks to all of you. I can tell there's some people in this audience who have thought a lot about invention. I've really benefited from the questions and the comments as well as his talk. So thank you as well for bringing your ideas and your thoughts to this. We will resume these author talks in 2022, God willing, and we'll let you all know about those then. So thank you all and have a good night.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.